Hi, everybody. I'm Emma, and I'm here with Ellen Mays, and we're going to talk about tracing your Irish roots in the Midwest. So we are going to talk a little bit about St. Louis because that's where Ellen and I are located. But this is just kind of an overall beginner's guide to genealogy research as far as Irish ancestors goes. So it's just kind of like a good beginner overview of Irish genealogy. And first off, just a quick little plug. Backlog is the name of my company. We're an archival consulting firm based in St. Louis, but we've done projects as far away as Wisconsin, which I guess is only 2 states away, but also Iowa. And we specialize also in Midwestern genealogy research. We're really good at kind of filling in some holes where some national firms can't be on the ground to get records. And so we do genealogy, we do family genealogy, like kind of family trees. We do some French and German transcriptions and translations. We found that a lot of it is also just trying to decipher what the word is that we need to translate. So a lot of that is just kind of familiarity with like older kinds of handwriting and block prints, kind of like with German, there's current script. There's a bunch of kind of little barriers that just kind of make the transcription just as tough as the translation. And then we also do archival consulting. So we've done some projects for clients like the Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, Missouri, where we help them set up a digital archive and we do some volunteer training. But today we're here for genealogy. Okay. And I'm Emma. Like I said, Backlog is my company. I worked as a university archivist for 5 years before I was laid off in 2020. And after searching for a job, I decided to kind of go out on my own. I found that lots of places need a little bit of help, but not full-time help. And we've kind of been able to kind of fill in the gaps here and there for some high schools in St. Louis and some smaller museums. And I kept getting asked for genealogy help. So I bring in people like Ellen to help me out with genealogy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen, and I'm really excited to talk to you all about Irish genealogy. I've worked in genealogy reference since 2016 and hold an MLIS from the University of Missouri-Columbia and an MA in public history with an emphasis in heritage education from Southeast Missouri State University. And for this webinar on beginning Irish genealogy, I'm going to discuss some key points, tips, and resources for researching your Irish ancestors. And some of the resources are specifically for Irish ancestors who settled in the Midwest.
So just a couple quick housekeeping things. We'll do a Q&A at the end. So if you just want to hold any questions, you can unmute at that time and just fire away, or you can put them in the chat. We will post this webinar to YouTube, and everybody who registered for the webinar, I will send you a link, and then all of the links that we mentioned today, we'll put in that YouTube description. So it'll be right there with the video. And again, I will email that to everybody tomorrow morning. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellen.
Okay, so we'll get started talking a little bit about Irish immigration and the different phases and waves that it transpired throughout history. And so Irish immigration occurred in several waves. And the first wave occurred between 1771 and 1773, when 32,000 Irish immigrants arrived in America. Many of these immigrants were from Ulster, and 6 counties of Ulster are part of Northern Ireland, and 3 are in the Republic of Ireland. So many of the immigrants coming from Ireland at this time were Scottish Protestants who had settled in Ireland, and prior to immigrating to America, they had been in Ulster for several years. By 1790, the Irish immigrant population in the United States had risen to 447,000. Next slide. So some of the common ports of departure from Ulster were Newry, Derry, Belfast, Portrush, and Arne. And other common ports that you'll find outside of Ulster included Dublin, Cork, and Waterford. However, 2/3 of the Irish immigrants came from Ulster, which is an interesting fact. Next slide. Between 1801 and 1921, 8 million Irish emigrated from Ireland. 80% of these immigrants were between the ages of 18 and 30. And during this time period, many of the Irish immigrants were Catholic. For a great reference on emigration from Ireland between 1851 and 1860, see the Tom's Almanac and Official Directory. It's a great resource and provides in tabular format all the different statistics for Irish immigration during this time. Next slide. So Irish immigration in the 19th century took place in 3 different phases, and 1 million immigrated between 1815 and 1845, 2.5 million between 1846 and 1855, and 4 million between 1856 and 1914. Next slide. So we'll talk about several of the different ports of entry into the United States. And when you're researching, you often want to find passenger lists, but knowing that there are different ports to check can be helpful for your research. So one of the largest ports of entry for Irish immigrants was Castle Garden. And Castle Garden was opened between 1855 and 1890. During this time, 2 million Irish immigrants came through Castle Garden. The New York passenger lists for Castle Garden between 1820 and 1891 are on familysearch.org, which is a great resource for locating records of Irish ancestors who came through Castle Garden. And it is a free website that you can access, but you do have to create an account if you don't have one already on Family Search. Next slide. So Ellis Island is probably the most well-known port of entry into the United States for immigrants. It was opened between 1892 and 1951. During this time, 3.5 million Irish immigrants came through Ellis Island, and the New York passenger arrival lists for Ellis Island are also on Family Search, but these lists cover the time period between 1892 and 1924. So you can also find these resources on, again, familysearch.org. If you search their research wiki page for Ellis Island and Irish immigration, they'll have helpful articles that will direct you directly to these links and collections for passenger lists. Next slide. The Port of New Orleans is another port that you might not be as familiar with, but was another common port of entry for Irish immigrants, particularly between the years 1842 and 1864. And once arriving in New Orleans, many of the Irish took steamboats to get to St. Louis. So if you have Irish ancestors who wound up in St. Louis, Missouri, and you haven't found their passenger lists at Ellis Island or Castle Garden, I would check the passenger lists for the Port of New Orleans as well. Next slide. So Boston is very much connected with Irish immigration to the United States. Constitution Wharf in Boston, Massachusetts is another possible port of entry for your Irish immigrant ancestors. Irish predominated between 1820 and 1880, and 2 historic neighborhoods for Irish immigrants in Boston are North End and Fort Hill. The Boston passenger lists between 1891 and 1943 can also be found on familysearch.org. Next slide. There was a great influx of immigrants to the Port of Philadelphia between 1847 and 1854. By 1860, the Irish were making up 16.7% of the total population in Philadelphia. A helpful resource for locating Philadelphia passenger lists is the Pennsylvania Philadelphia Passenger Lists Collection, 1800 to 1882 and 1883 to 1945 on familysearch.org. Next slide. Irish immigrants also arrived at the Port of Baltimore in the mid-1800s. By 1880, the Irish made up 25% of Baltimore's immigrant population. Next slide. By 1880, the Irish population in St. Louis, Missouri had grown to 28,536. the Irish community in St. Louis is represented with their influence on the social and cultural history of St. Louis. There were 29 Irish Catholic churches in St. Louis City, and many Irish immigrants to St. Louis originated from counties Galway, Cork, Louth, Tyrone, Donegal, Mayo, Carlow, Kerry, and Dublin City. Next slide. There were two main population centers and neighborhoods in St. Louis. The Kerry Patch, located on the north side, was home to many Irish immigrants. Their primary parish was St. Bridget of Arran, which was established in 1853. The other large neighborhood of Irish immigrants was Cheltenham or Dogtown on the south side. St. James the Great Parish, established in 1860, was the main parish for the Irish living in Cheltenham or the Dogtown neighborhood. Next slide. Several Irish organizations were founded in St. Louis to help the immigrants as they started their new lives in St. Louis. And these organizations include the Arran Benevolent Society, the Irish Emigrant Society, the Shamrock Society, the United Sons of Arran Benevolent Society, and the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Next slide. Some wonderful books for learning more about the Irish in St. Louis include From Kerry Patch to Little Powderhorn by Kenneth T. O'Connor, Irish St. Louis by David A. Lossos, The St. Louis Irish by Ellen M. Dolan, and Early Irish Settlers in St. Louis, Missouri and Dogtown Neighborhood by Sandra M. Brunsman. Next slide. So reviewing the history of Ireland helps to provide important context for understanding what records are available and what types of events might have produced records for your ancestors. So the early Irish history really picks up in 1536 when the Church of Ireland became the State Church of Ireland. Following that, in 1603, the plantation of Ulster was started. In 1649, the Second English Conquest by Oliver Cromwell occurred in Ireland. And then in 1720, British Parliament began to legislate for Ireland. In 1801, the UK of Great Britain and Ireland was established. Another important event was in 1829 with the Catholic Relief Act. The new Poor Law Act and the formation of the Poor Law Union started in 1838. And the civil registration of non-Catholic marriages started in 1845. The Great Irish Famine, which many people have heard about, occurred between 1845 and 1852. And then during that time period in 1850, the Reform Act was also passed, which based the right to vote on occupation rather than on property ownership. In 1864, civil registration of births and deaths occurred and were added along with Catholic marriages. So if you're looking for Catholic marriages in Ireland, you'll start to see those more prominently starting in 1864. Next slide. Important events of the 20th century in Irish history include the Easter Uprising, which took place April 24th through 29th, 1916, the Irish Civil War that lasted from June 28th, 1922 until May 23rd, 1923, the establishment of the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland on December 6th, 1922, and the founding of the Republic of Ireland on April 18th, 1949. Next slide. Another really critical event that occurred throughout Irish history was the destruction of the Four Courts building, which occurred on June 30th, 1922. And why this was so significant is that because of the destruction of this building, a large amount of Irish records were lost. And some of these records that were lost include the Irish censuses of 1821, 1831, 1841, and 1851. In addition to the census returns between 1861 and 1891. In addition to those census records, over half of the Church of Ireland registers were destroyed. The majority of wills and testament records, all pre-1900 documents from legal courts, and all pre-1900 local government documents. Next slide. When researching Irish surnames, it is important to remember that there are often multiple spellings for the same surname. Here's an example of the different forms and spellings of the name Doherty. You may also run into the occurrence of nicknames and common naming patterns within Irish families. Many names of parents and grandparents were carried forward with children and grandchildren. So you often see common names repeated when you're researching your Irish ancestors. Next slide. When researching records in Northern Ireland, there are two important places and organizations to know about, and they include the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland and the Ulster Historical Foundation. Next slide. In the Republic of Ireland, the National Library of Ireland, rootsireland.ie, and Irish Ancestors by johngrenham.com are three important sources of information in Irish records. Genealogy.ie is another great database for locating records for Irish ancestors. And the links to these resources, I believe, will be provided later in the description of this video for your reference. Next slide. It's also helpful to understand the land divisions in Ireland when trying to locate records. This helps to figure out which record collection sets to check and what's the most useful for your research interests and goals. So the land divisions work down from largest to smallest, and they start with the province level, county, barony, civil parish, Roman Catholic parish, and poor law union, and townland. Next slide. When you're researching Ireland, you'll notice some common place names, and four ancient provinces you'll often hear in the history of Ireland are Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, and Munster. And when you're doing your research, you'll often find reference to these provinces. It also helps with geographic understanding of location. And there's also separate histories and local histories about each of these provinces as well. Next slide. Church records for Irish ancestral research are very helpful. Aside from locating church records in the United States, you can also locate Catholic church records at the National Library of Ireland, which is a great resource for your Irish research. Next slide. Church of Ireland records can be accessed through the Ulster Historical Foundation, and the Family Search Research Wiki article about Church of Ireland records also has many great resources and links to those resources for Church of Ireland records. So that's another great resource to check. Next slide. And lastly, Presbyterian church records can also be researched through the Ulster Historical Foundation, which I've mentioned previously, as well as familysearch.org. Next slide. So to locate an Irish ancestral town of origin, it's important to first try and locate all of the possible records for your ancestors in the US before trying to work back to Ireland. For example, locating a civil marriage record will often help you locate the church marriage record. The church marriage records often include the parents' names and place of origin. And after locating that information about the parents' names and place of origin, you can then search for census records to find other siblings or other relatives that they may have immigrated and come over with. Other records that are helpful to locate include naturalization records, death certificates, obituaries, family Bibles, local histories, as well as fraternal and social organization records. So these are all great resources to check for immigration information and place of origin information as well. Next slide. So the following databases are important resources for locating Irish records online. All of these have been mentioned previously, but are really helpful for researchers who are trying to access different types of Irish records from census and civil records to church records. And links to these databases will also be provided for you in the description as well. Thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about some of the Irish records and ancestor research. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, and I will also get back to you if there's something that I can't answer immediately. Then drop your email in the chat box and we will get back to you as well.
Okay, so we just have a quick conclusion. Just start with what you know. Think about the port of entry that they came in. And then there also were several ports of entry in Canada, but we didn't go over those because I thought we'd be running over on time. So especially if you have, ancestors in places like Michigan or Wisconsin, you'd want to check those Canadian seaports. And then a lot of what Ellen went over was kind of like what was the national landscape at the time when they left. And that might be able to tell you a lot about what records would be available, especially kind of with that fire. And that one photograph was a photo of what was left of the building. And then another thing to remember is the land divisions, that it's not like county state here, that it had town land and the different parishes. And so it's just kind of like a whole different way to think about just where records would be located and how they're sorted. Okay. So really quickly, again, Backlog is the name of our company. We do genealogy research, French and German translations, and then archival consulting. This photograph is actually like a capture of someone whose great grandfather came from Ireland, and he needed his birth record to apply for Irish citizenship. I don't know if he's been successful yet, but that's just one example of something we were asked this spring to find. And it just kind of like was navigating, what records would be around. It was definitely a Catholic record. And then we had to reach out to the parish to get a certified copy because it was for a legal purpose. And so we can also look, like aid with citizen application research. We've done some Polish citizenship research that seems to be kind of a hot one right now, and then looking up church records, and then also, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, transcriptions. All right, and then if you want to check out more of what we've talked about before, if you go to our YouTube page, this fall we did a whole preservation series on like if you have AV materials, if you have paper materials, meaning like documentation of like, like birth and death certificates, and then photographs and books. And so that's a whole series. And that's kind of like really geared towards your family archivist, which cousin has all of the stuff and how are they taking care of it. So that's definitely, that series is really geared towards family oriented, budget oriented options for archiving your materials. And then we just finished up this spring. We did 2 webinars on Illinois-based genealogy. So we did one on Abraham Lincoln's papers and the other record sets that pertain to him. So if you have anybody in central Illinois, and it was kind of cool because it seemed like anybody who ever knew this guy, because he turned out, grew up to be president, wrote a history of how they knew him. And so basically anybody who was in the town of New Salem, if they were, like lived in the same time frame as Lincoln, they're going to be mentioned in these, these citizen histories that were taken. And then also there are records pertaining to the Black Hawk War, and whether or not you're from central Illinois, it was really interesting just to see like how one man's life makes everyone around him just better documented, because people just wanted to record that. And then the other one that we did was on the Kaskaskia manuscripts, which has to do with Southern Illinois genealogy. And that's a record set of French records, like from the Illinois country. And so now we'll take some questions. And I think we've got a couple of things in the chat. And so our first question is from Jean, whose family is the Rooney family. And Jean's question is, and Ellen, I don't know if you know this one, is where might she find passenger lists in Boston before the 1890s?
So the Massachusetts Archives has a list of arrivals in Boston from 1848 to 1891. And I might actually be able to put a link to it in the chat for you if you want to investigate it as well.
We can also put that in later. Oh, looks like you've got it in. And then B. Beck suggested that we also look at the virtual treasury of Ireland as a resource. So thank you for that suggestion, B. Beck. And we know that this was a very general overview. This was just supposed to be kind of a beginner's where to get started. And again, it's very much just kind of thinking about the context and the time of when your family emigrated. And that really will point you in the direction of what records might be available.
So the virtual treasury of Ireland is actually really interesting because it's a digital repository where they've tried to reconstruct some of the records and images that were destroyed in the 1922 incident. So that's a really great resource. So thank you for sharing that as well.
Yeah. So again, I will post the recording to YouTube, and that is our YouTube channel. I've got it up right now. And all of the links to all these resources, and we'll also throw in that virtual treasury will be in the description, and then from there you can just kind of link out and take a look at all these things. And I've just found that putting everything in one spot like the description is just the best way to get the information to everybody. So if there aren't any questions, I know this was just kind of a quick overview. But thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to end it there.
Thank you.
Thanks.